Welcome back to the Baird Retirement Management Show. I'm joined once again by Greg Ashcroft and Scott Bartosh. Today we are demystifying the process of working with a financial advisor as you enter retirement. A lot of people have reservations before their first meeting because they aren't sure if they're ready for retirement, what to expect during that first meeting, or even what kind and how much information to share ahead of the meeting. Scott, where should we begin?
I think where we begin today is thinking, let's put on our thinking caps and imagine how far you are as a person who's worked their entire life from separating from maybe not working entirely, but the job you're doing right now. So say you're in your 50s and you are looking at possibly retiring at some point. You know that you are going to need a substantial amount of money to cover the rest of your life. You know that you might have kids to take care of or send to college. You know that you have moving expenses if you're thinking about downsizing, something like that. As you start to get some clarity on what that picture would look like as you leave job one to maybe move into job two, maybe you've been on the FIRE forums and you're going to go be a barista for a few years because that is what you enjoy and what you'd like to do.
Freelance writer.
Yeah, freelance writer or sports blogger.
I'm a nomadic bartender.
It could be any of those things. As you are looking at that transition and it's starting to feel more real, I think the first thing that I would do is think about who would I trust with this information? And our hope would be that if you're listening to this podcast, that you might have a little bit of trust in our view on the situation. The first thing that I want to do when I talk to somebody who is entering this phase of life is get an idea of what's the timeline and what are the big bogeys or what are the absolute must-haves. Is it this amount per month? Is it, I need to move to Colorado, I need to move to Wisconsin, back to family, whatever it might be? What are the absolute must-haves? And then we can really start a conversation about where we go from there.
Yeah, and I think all of that is extremely valuable. There's a lot of very sensible things people fail to do only because they're intimidated by the process of doing it. You see this in medicine where people have some unfortunate pain or a sudden pain or something that scares them. And rather than immediately seeking help from a trusted doctor, they go to the disaster that is WebMD. Now, this isn't anything against WebMD, but even WebMD would tell you, do not use this as a diagnostic tool. This is a baseline amount of information you can get for free, and they provide that to us, and that is a service. But even they would say, you need to go visit your doctor to discuss these things. I think about this in terms of our finances and the clients that we work with all the time, where in most cases, once a client has employed us, it's one of those services that you don't develop a strong affinity for until you've actually tried it. A lot of people will move from managing their own finances vis-a-vis reading all the personal financial planning literature out there, and there is a lot, and some of it is very good, to working with a full-service professional advisor, and they will never look back. So if you look at the flows of people going from Camp A, which is do-it-yourself, to Camp B, which is working with an advisor, I would venture that way more people move from a very inexpensive method of doing it themselves to a, albeit more expensive but more professional kind of white glove service of working with an advisor. And then they want to go out and tell people this was the best decision that I ever made.
One interesting distinction there is that a lot of do-it-yourself is don't do it at all. We work with a lot of people who set it and forget it in a 401k and don't think about it until they're maybe a couple of years out from retirement. And that's a reasonable way to do it. I've worked with a lot of people who that was the path they took and it worked.
One of the things we try to enlighten people on is you have a financial plan. You do. It's either the financial plan that you've developed by chance, you've just set it and forget it, and you have a misallocation in your 401k you don't discover until later than optimal, or you have a financial plan by choice. You're going to have one of these things by chance or by choice. We certainly would much rather you have the formation of a financial plan be a deliberate process where you're consulting with somebody who knows what they're talking about. Now, like I said, there's a lot of not necessarily free, but plenty of free, and sometimes you get what you pay for, financial advice out there on the internet. You could go to Barnes & Noble, spend all day, and you could read every flavor of financial planning book that you would want. I think some of that stuff is truly valuable. But I know from my personal experience, I want to talk to a person who has either done this before or who has helped a person through exactly what it is that I'm walking through. I think that provides a little bit of coverage for people who are, as we said in the opening, a little bit coy about sharing part of their financial lives with a person whom they might not have ever met right out of the gate. But, and we were talking about this a little bit before we started recording, the effectiveness of your doctor is going to grow in direct proportion to how vulnerable and honest you're willing to be with him or her about what's actually plaguing you. It doesn't do you any good to stave off working with an advisor because you've got this growing problem. And now that problem, maybe it's credit card debt, maybe it's you're underwater on a car note, you don't feel very confident with your allocation in your 401k plan. If you let that problem persist and grow, by the time you're working with an advisor, they might say, man, really wish that you had just brought this to my attention years ago.
Yeah, and I think that's a great segue into what are the things that we actually need to make some of these suggestions. And in my view, there's really three things that I would say I absolutely need. I need to know, when are you thinking about retiring? Because, and what does that entail? I mean, as a add-on question.
Well, as a baseline, the timeline is important.
The timeline is extremely important, because if it's 2062, then I may not be the guy for you.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. We might say you're going to be better served just buy aggressive.
Yeah.
Let it ride, you know? Because if it's 2062, we're talking almost 40 years in the future.
You can probably do it yourself if you're 40 years out from retirement.
Yes.
So when are you going to retire? What is that going to look like? That is the first data point that we really need. The second is, what are the assets and the income that you have accumulated? This is things like pensions, 401ks, brokerage accounts, Social Security. That's a big component. A lot of people discount it, feeling like it's not a big deal, but it's extremely important, especially if, say, you and a spouse both worked, even if you didn't. It's going to move the needle significantly. So that's leg two, which is, what are the things that you have that are either going to produce income for you in that next phase of life, or are spendable in the event that something comes up? From there, the third thing that we really need is your willingness to share and talk to us about the situation you're in. As we talked about in the debt episode last week, if you've got some unsecured debt, credit cards, personal loan, you tell us about it, because there might be things that we can do to help you in terms of consolidating it, or at least putting a plan together to spend that down.
Returning to the question of maybe feeling this mild sense of intimidation, because that's totally natural. Anytime you're going to go and meet with a person who's a subject matter expert, maybe you feel a little bit shy about your particular situation. What we're trying to convey to clients is, we're not here to render judgment on you. It's not a pass-fail scenario when you come in and see a financial advisor where you're going to be told, yes, well done, you saved exactly as you should have saved, you're perfectly set up for your retirement, good job, or no, you can't retire. Sometimes we have that unfortunate conversation, but it's through a process of discovery, and it's really not you're never going to be able to retire. It's if you want to retire into the lifestyle that you've elucidated here are the things that we need to do in order to make that a reality.
That's a great segue for just any conversation. Is you're not there yet, but you can get there. And that, if you have that conversation, going back to what you were saying about kind of letting some of these issues fester, if you kind of understand that you're not on the right track when you're 42, that can be so much more helpful than figuring it out as you're walking out the door.
Oh yeah, and I think more often than not, when a client comes in, they have these expectations and they're worried about implications. What we do is provide relief for some anxiety that clients discover was needless. So they're thinking, oh my gosh, I've heard all of these values that you need, and why don't I have whole life policy, and why don't I do infinite banking, and am I being left behind because I'm not on the Bitcoin train yet, and all this other stuff. And they bring it to our attention, and we look at their plans, and we look at the life they want to live in retirement, what they need to spend as a proportion of their assets. And almost right away, we can settle some of their nerves by saying, guys, you're in great shape. You've done really well. You're going to be able to do this, and it's not going to be as risky as you think, or it's not going to be as risky as the media has made it seem like it might be. The world is actually not coming to an end. You're going to be able to retire the way that you want to retire. And the relief that they feel, knowing that, wow, all of this angst and worry that I had about our finances and this burden that I was carrying, they get to walk away with this weightlessness, being like, well, I'll be. We were way better off than we had thought coming in to see an advisor. I thought we were going to get a wrist slap, and instead we got an attaboy.
That is a really good point, because as we've talked about, this discussion is leading into the things that we need to look at your case.
Yeah.
And I kind of described a few of those a second ago. I send out a checklist that basically touches on all of those things. This is maybe a little bit too blunt, and I wish I had, more of an attaboy or something, but I get these checklists back after people have kind of bared their financial situation to me, and we've got all sorts of analyzers and Monte Carlo simulators, software, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I look at this checklist, which is a one-pager, and I'll say, that's going to work.
Yeah.
And so very likely that's the reaction that you're going to get, is that if you are listening to this podcast and you are thinking about retirement, you're going to get there. It's really just about, how do we optimize this? How do we make sure that this is tax efficient? Are there specific things like special needs or college that you need to cover? And let's do it.
And then I think on the tail end of kind of the things that we need from them, setting their expectations for retirement, we also don't want people to be coy about some of the one-off expenses that they might have, so that we can diligently plan for those. They have these things where I want to buy this, classic car, or I want to pay for college for all of my grandkids or whatever. And they have this fear that, maybe I really just need to keep this to myself. I need to put this in this box and not let it see the light of day. And then I can kind of go about this in a way that isn't exactly optimal. But if they brought us to our attention, not only would we encourage them and say, I think it's wonderful that you're doing that. Let us, like you said, polish it up a little bit. Just make it so that's not only going to serve the people that you want to serve or the interests that you want to serve, but it's going to do so in a way that isn't bringing the government in or the IRS in a way that could have been avoided.
Maybe you do it even better than you imagined.
Yeah.
You've got, 50th anniversary trip that you want to take all the kids and grandkids on, and you'd budgeted a certain amount for it. Maybe we tell you, hey, you can double that.
I was going to say, how many times has a client come in and been like, there's something I want to discuss with you, but it seems kind of risky to do this. We want to go on this cruise and pay for everybody in the family, and it's going to cost this much money. And they tell us, and that the number is supposed to have this gravity, but we're looking at their plan, and we know this stuff very well. As you said, you can just glance at a checklist, and you have a pretty good idea as whether or not that's going to work. They tell us the figure that they need to produce for this one-off trip they want to send their family on and make really wonderful core memories from, and they're really worried. And then we put them at ease, and we're like, don't do it this way. Like, don't scrimp here. Actually spend a little bit more money on this, because that's going to increase how easy the trip's going to be. It's going to increase the duration. That's going to be a better way of traveling.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I encourage people a lot in retirement is, if it really truly is a one-off, treat yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, if it's kind of lifestyle creep that is just happening every single month, then that's where you really, that's a very different conversation. But if we're really talking about like a once every decade kind of expenditure, do it up.
Well, we have a lot of clients who come in to see us who they're a little bit worried about the prospects of their retirement, whether or not their plan is going to work, whether or not they can retire into the lifestyle that they want to live, and we get to assuage their fears. There are certainly some cases where we would encourage a person to go see a financial planner, even if the verdict that they reach with their planner is that you're not quite ready to retire. And that does happen from time to time.
It does.
And I think that those people are perhaps best served by having intersected a financial planner before they made the often not irrevocable decision of retiring, because you could go look for different work, but they can use this information they receive from the financial planner and go back to their place of work and say, you know what, I felt like retiring. Maybe they can negotiate for slightly higher pay. Maybe there's some things that we can point out to them that will streamline some of their expenses in retirement, that will help them between not quite ready to retire to get to be ready to retire, maybe on a slightly delayed timeline than would otherwise have been optimal.
This broadcast contains the current opinions of the hosts and are subject to change. The broadcast is provided for informational purposes only and should not be considered investment advice or recommendations. Investors should obtain professional advice before making investment decisions. This is not a complete analysis of every material fact regarding any company, industry, or security. The information has been obtained from sources we consider to be reliable but cannot guarantee their accuracy. Robert W. Baird & Co. Incorporated is not a legal or tax services provider, and you are strongly encouraged to seek the advice of the appropriate professional advisors before taking any action. For more information about any companies discussed, please contact Baird. Past performance is not indicative of future results, and diversification does not ensure a profit or protect against loss. All investments carry some level of risk, including loss of principal. An investment cannot be made directly in an index. The broadcast may not be reproduced without express permission of Robert W. Baird & Co., Incorporated.